Welcome to the Nonfiction Writers, podcasting in a great way. I'm Ryan Aber, joined by Jason Kersey. Jason, I think the other day I said next week. We're actually back a little bit earlier than that. I don't know what I was thinking.
You made a mistake. Shocking.
I know. Anybody who listens to this podcast regularly, which we hope there's still those of you that do, knows that that's certainly not a big surprise. But here we are back later in the week to talk about defensive line as we continue to break down OU's roster position by position leading up to the season opener. And we talked, Jason, in the offensive line about big holes to fill. Well, there's some pretty big ones on the defensive front as well.
Yeah, no doubt. One especially big one that they got to fill, and that's replacing Jordan Phillips. Matt Romar seems like the guy who's going to take over that spot. But I think it's going to be interesting to see just how they attack on defense. Are they going to go with 4 defensive linemen or 3? And that's going to make a big difference as to who actually plays a lot, because it would seem that they have enough tackles now, particularly with Walker and Romar and then Wade, to go back to that, which is, I think a big reason why they went away from it before was because they didn't have very many tackles they really felt good about. That's why they had Chuka and Dulaway in there briefly, but now they have the depth there, I think, to actually play with four linemen.
Yeah, I expect we're going to see a 4-man front quite a bit this year with the guys that they have on the interior. You mentioned Matt Romar, who showed some flashes last year. Charles Walker, I thought was really good at times as well. But obviously replacing Jordan Phillips and the job he did in the middle, and I think he gets knocked a little bit because of motor and things like that. But I think it's taken for granted some of the times what he was able to do last year in freeing up especially linebackers to go make plays because of what he was able to do in the middle.
Well, not just that. I think the ability that he had to make plays himself is something that they're going to miss. I mean, that was the thing about him. He was so good and so athletic that he could not only eat up those blocks, he could also go through the line and make plays. And there aren't very many guys like that who can do that. And I think that's one of the reasons that despite really an overall maybe not the best college career in terms of just the overall production, the injuries, the like you said, the concerns about his motor, he was still drafted in the second round.
Sticking with defensive tackles for a little bit, we've mentioned Romar and Walker and briefly touched on Wade. Wade's a little bit confounding to me because of how much he played and really how well he played in the 2014 season when Jordan Phillips went down with the back injury after the Notre Dame game, but really was just an afterthought last year. Do you expect Wade or any of those other younger guys, guys like Neville Gallimore, Courtney Garnett, to contribute in any significant way next season?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think Neville Gallimore is one to really watch. He's going to come in, I think, as ready to play as just about anybody. But yeah, Jordan Wade is interesting because I remember he started so many games 2 years ago. Started the Sugar Bowl against Alabama. And then when Bob Stoops released the first depth chart last season, he was 4th, which, almost seemed like a little bit of a message to him potentially. Maybe he was using that to send him a message. But I don't know about that either because he didn't play all that much really last year. So that's definitely going to be interesting to see what they do with Jordan Wade. But it's weird that he's, you'd think a guy who played so much, then didn't play hardly at all, then dropped to 4th on the depth chart. You would think that a guy like that wouldn't stick around, but he's still here. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, moving to the outside defensive end, you got to start with Charles Tapper and the contributions that he's made over the last couple of years. Last year, numbers weren't quite as impressive as they were as a sophomore a couple years ago, but I think part of that is what they were doing. I know he did have some struggles at times last year, but certainly going to be a big key for them on the defensive front.
Well, yeah, no doubt about it. I think that he's going to have a chance to have a really good senior year and have a chance to be a relatively high draft pick the next year. I think he's a really talented guy, and there's really, I don't think, anything to worry about with him. I think he's one of the more solid pieces on this team.
Looking at the other side, though, this is one of the more intriguing positions. I think you've got Matt Diamond, who's had some flashes, and then you've got DJ Ward, a guy that garnered a lot of attention when he came to OU. Had the appendectomy and had to sit out for a while, and has just sort of been a background guy, but a lot of really positive talk about what he was able to do in the spring.
Yeah, there was, and definitely, I think it's going to be really interesting to see who winds up being the guy on that other side of the defensive line. They've certainly got some intriguing prospects there. To me, DJ Ward is one of the most intriguing guys on the team. You obviously know him far better than I do from covering him when he was at Lawton and then at Douglas and then at Southmore. That whole weird deal. I mean, this guy hasn't played much football really since his junior year of high school at Lawton, and so we know how talented he is. Everybody wanted him coming out of high school.
He's the best defensive lineman that I've ever seen at the high school level. Just because generally when you're covering a high school game, and I know you're familiar with this, but when you got to keep your own stats, there's not a whole lot of time to pay attention to some of the nuances and who's making plays outside of who actually makes the tackle, things like that. But DJ Ward, even with all of that stuff, when you're trying to track, how long was the run, who got the carry, all that stuff, you can see DJ Ward making plays. And he was one of my favorite guys to cover at Lawton, and I know the crazy saga of him, jumping from school to school. But I always really enjoyed covering him both on the field and off the field, and he's an interesting guy, and he's one of the guys that you sort of root for on this team.
Yeah, I sort of felt bad for him. With everything, because you could tell that a lot of that wasn't his fault. There were other things in play there, and family issues and OSSAA issues and all that kind of stuff. That stuff wasn't all his fault, and I don't think any of it was his fault, honestly. And then he had the medical thing his freshman year at OU, which may have prevented him from being able to play. So it was like you said, I think he's a good guy, and you root for a guy like that.
All right, Jason. So just going off pure stats, let's throw out Charles Tapper, because I think everybody sort of knows what to expect on him. But who's the other guy on this defensive line that you expect to really put up good numbers and be a guy who can be consistent in this group?
Well, it'd be easy to say Matt Romar, I think, because everybody's pretty sure he's going to be the starter. I'm going to say Neville Gallimore comes in and makes a big impact and plays a lot up front, and maybe even starts by the end of the year. I'll say Neville Gallimore.
All right. Once again, you steal my thunder with your guy, but I'm going to go on a similar track. I think Charles Walker's a guy who really showed some flashes last year before he got hurt. I think he's a guy who has the potential to be a guy who comes sort of out of nowhere and winds up having a very solid year for this group.
And people have been talking about him since he was a true freshman and how impressive he was. So yeah, he could definitely be the guy.
Yeah, so once again, defensive line, a lot of questions there, but we'll start to get some answers here in a couple months.
You know what? We before we go, we have to at least talk about the coaching change up there.
Oh yeah. I guess we should
it just occurred to me we're going to go out of this podcast and never mention that big part of this story. So.
Yeah, last year Jerry Montgomery was a guy who was making all kinds of waves in the recruiting trail. Gets a lot of these guys that we've talked about. The players that played for him loved him. He had a great group last year, the last couple years that he's been there, and then all of a sudden he's gone very abruptly after signing day, after getting a job with an NFL team that you and I are both very familiar with. But then they bring in Dyron Reynolds, who on paper at least was a little bit of a head-scratcher because of his experience, at least over the last decade, but he's intriguing, and the players have seemed to really respond to him.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And he's very intriguing. He's got an interesting background. He spent time in the NFL, not much time as an actual position coach in the NFL, but he did a lot of he worked a lot with under Tony Dungy, under Leslie Frazier. So he's definitely an intriguing guy. He's still fairly young. The biggest thing is going to be replacing the recruiting prowess that was Jerry Montgomery. I mean, Jerry Montgomery was able to go get guys who weren't even defensive linemen, Ricky DeBerry, stuff like people like that. So, I mean, to me, how much he replaces or how well he does on the recruiting trail is going to be as big a deal as anything.
Yeah, no doubt about that. I think he's a guy who can be judged more in February than maybe this season, but it'll certainly be interesting to watch. Well, thanks for that reminder, Jason, but this time it's for real. We'll be back next week with yet another edition of the podcast where we continue to break down the defensive side of the ball for OU's roster. Until then, you can check us out every day at newsok.com and every morning in the Oklahoman for the best OU coverage anywhere.